So what do you think about when you see a cross? Or what do you think about when we celebrate the Lord's Supper at church? What do those symbols remind you of? I think we've seen them so much that there probably are times where we really don't think of much of anything, or they don't remind us of much of anything. In fact, I sometimes wonder about those who wear crosses, of whether they are wearing them because they really understand and believe in the symbolism, or just because it happens to be a cool and interesting thing to do. Either way, these symbols have been given to us as reminders. They are reminders of what we deserve, and yet how God provided a substitute for us. A cross, for example, is a reminder of death. That's what it's there for, the kind of death that we deserve because of our sin. It's a reminder of God's wrath against our sin that is great and how we deserve hell. Yet it's also a reminder of a very specific cross, the one cross on which Jesus himself died, so that the wrath of God would be satisfied. The Lord's Supper is the same. The bread and wine are reminders of what we deserve, that we are the ones who deserve to have our blood shed and our bodies broken. But they're also reminders of what Jesus came to do for us. The Passover is that kind of reminder as well. On the first night, when the destroyer was going through Egypt, seeking the firstborn of all the households, and how they likely heard screams of grief as parents cried out for their dead firstborn, a Hebrew household would be looking at the meal in front of them and think, I deserve to be crying out too. But because God provided the substitute, we're alive. God commanded them to celebrate this meal, which would be the first of many throughout the centuries. And the whole meal was to remind them of their bondage in Egypt and God's gracious redemption of them, as well as God's forgiveness of their sins, of the judgment that they all deserved. But at the center of the meal was the lamb. All those other details of the Passover meal were important, but only the blood of the lamb would make the destroyer pass over their house and go to the next. But why blood, though? Why did blood have to be painted on the doorposts and on the sides? Well, to put it simply, it's because blood represents the life. And the life of the substitute had to be offered in the place of the firstborn. It's been this way ever since the beginning. In Genesis 3, God offers a sacrifice instead of Adam and Eve. In Genesis 4, Abel's sacrifice is accepted because it's a lamb, not fruit. In Genesis 22, Abraham is commanded to offer up his own son, his firstborn. But at the last moment, right before he sheds Isaac's blood, God provides a lamb as a substitute instead of Isaac. And then over the years, until now, here, lambs replace the firstborn. As the author of Hebrews writes 1,500 years after this, in chapter 9, verse 22, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. God's judgment would fall on every family, Egyptian and Hebrew alike, unless a substitute died in their place. And this really wouldn't have been lost on the family as they celebrated that first Passover on that first night, especially the firstborn. They would have cared for the lamb for 4 days. That's what God had commanded, to bring the lamb in the house and care for it for 4 days. And then on the morning of the Passover, they'd kill it. And on the night, they'd cook it, and the father would explain that it died as their substitute. The firstborn would look at it and think, that lamb died instead of me, so that I could live. And let's not miss the fact that God even provided the lambs by protecting the Hebrews' flocks from the devastation of the plagues that the Egyptians underwent and had to suffer. The Hebrews had lambs to sacrifice because of God's grace to them. They simply had to celebrate the Passover in faith, trusting that God would accept the sacrifice in their place. Now, the Passover wasn't just done then, it was done every year from then on out, throughout the generations, as chapter 12, verse 14 says. In fact, God even reoriented their calendar around the Passover. It was the beginning of their year now. They began their year by thinking about God had rescued them from Egypt and forgiven their sins by the blood of the Lamb. Yet there's also a sense of incompleteness to it. Every year, they'd celebrate the Passover. Every year, they'd offer more lambs and more bulls and more goats for the forgiveness of sins. And yet that forgiveness was never complete because they had to keep doing it over and over again. So they'd know that a better sacrifice had to come. Even as a faithful Israelite looked at a Passover lamb or looked and remembered God's salvation in the past, they would know that a future salvation was coming, had to come, that a better sacrifice was coming. Ultimate sacrifice that would forgive their sins forever. And we'll get to that in the rest of this week. So, actually, we'll get to it tomorrow, now that I think about it. So you guys think about that until then, and I'll see you tomorrow.